The FBI says it's investigating Russia's possible interference in the U.S. election. There are many accusations and counterclaims in this story, but is politics at play? And how will this affect President Donald Trump's White House? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. Critics of U.S. President Donald Trump have for months been saying that Russia tried to influence the election to help him win. Now the head of the FBI says his agency is in fact investigating that claim. The White House insists the Trump campaign never coordinated with Russia, but there's been evidence that members of the campaign met Russian politicians and then lied about it. So the accusations persist. We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, our Washington editor James Bays has this report.
In front of a congressional committee, the FBI director taking the unusual step of confirming details of an ongoing investigation. James Comey says Russian hacking of the election was clearly meant to help Donald Trump, and he says he wants to find out if there was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians.
I have been authorized by the Department of Justice to confirm that the FBI, as part of our counterintelligence mission, is investigating the Russian government's efforts to interfere in the 2016 presidential election. And that includes investigating the nature of any links between individuals associated with the Trump campaign and the Russian government.
That statement will cause concern in the White House. But things only got worse for the administration when Director Comey was asked about President Trump's explosive allegation on Twitter that his phones had been wiretapped by his predecessor, President Obama.
With respect to the president's tweets about alleged wiretapping directed at him by the prior administration, I have no information that supports those tweets.
Trump repeated the allegation as recently as Friday in the presence of German Chancellor Angela Merkel.
At least we have something in common, perhaps.
That only hours after the White House repeated an unfounded suggestion that the British spy agency GCHQ may have been used by Obama to monitor Trump. The director of the National Security Agency said relations with both key allies had been damaged.
I think it clearly frustrates a key ally of ours.
But it's not helpful.
Yes, sir.
At the White House, they were in damage control mode. Press Secretary Sean Spicer refusing to back down on Trump's wiretapping tweets, and then on Trump associates who may have had contact with Russia. This was his response.
There is a discussion, I heard some names floated around before, that were hangers-on around the campaign. And I think at some point, people that, got thrown around at the beginning of this hearing, some of those names, the greatest amount of interaction that they've had is had cease and desist letters sent to them.
What happened here is politically damaging for the White House. The FBI director saying he has no evidence to back President Trump's claims that he was wiretapped by President Obama. But in the long term, the FBI investigation into the election is likely to be more of a problem. Whatever the eventual outcome, it means that for many months there'll be a shadow hanging over the Trump administration. James Bays, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, this probe into Trump's campaign is only an extension of an FBI investigation that began last July. That's when the Democratic National Committee emails were hacked and leaked, helping President Trump's campaign. The FBI confirmed in December that Russia was behind the hack. President Barack Obama imposed sanctions and expelled Russian diplomats over those allegations. But there were suspicions that the Trump campaign was part of it. Those allegations have become even more common since Trump took office. The former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn resigned in February after he failed to disclose his meeting with the Russian ambassador to the U.S. And there have been calls for Attorney General Jeff Sessions to resign as well. During his confirmation hearing, he did not tell senators about meetings with that same Russian ambassador. Well, let's bring in our guests now in Washington. We have Mark Jacobson, former advisor to U.S. Defense Secretary Ash Carter and a specialist on American presidential transitions and national security. In Boston, we have Glenn Carle, a veteran of the CIA and former Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats on the National Intelligence Council. Also in Washington, we have Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and co-director of its Center on 21st Century Security and Intelligence. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. Mark Jacobson, I guess the headline grabbing takeaway from these hearings is the fact that the head of the FBI has now acknowledged that there is, in fact, an ongoing investigation of the Trump campaign's ties to Russia. What else do you think came out of those hearings that is noteworthy?
There are two things that I took away from yesterday's hearings. The first is that there should be no doubt in anyone's mind, regardless of politics, that the Russians were trying to influence the election and influence it in a way that was advantageous to Russian foreign policy. I think that Director Comey clearly tried to stay out of the partisan politics of this, but there can be no doubt of what the Russians were trying to do. The second piece, I think you saw an undercurrent of this, whether or not President Trump has tried to be flippant or he's being a bit ignorant, the misleading statements on Twitter, and not just the one about President Obama and the wiretapping, but countless tweets to date, these are having an impact on our alliances abroad. And in the most basic sense, they are damaging American national security. Has
going back to his claims about the wiretapping from the Obama administration, has that been well and truly debunked now, or does it depend on how the White House reacts?
It depends who you ask. I think if you talk to the members of Congress who are at the committee hearing, I think if you talk to respected national security analysts, they'll say that's truly been debunked. But what we saw yesterday is, once again, Sean Spicer trying to parse statements, or as one reporter said, twisting himself into a pretzel to try and get around this, suggesting perhaps that nothing has changed at all. The president might still be right. Maybe something else has happened. And I think this is really disrespectful, not only to the position of the press secretary, but to the White House overall. If the White House doesn't have credibility and cannot acknowledge when it's made a basic error, how are we going to trust the White House when it comes to more serious issues?
Glenn Carle, there were a lot of questions in those hearings that Director Comey chose not to answer because of the fact that it's an ongoing investigation. He said every time when he was asked about a specific U.S. person, he could not get into that. What do you think that in itself tells us?
Oh, well, silence does speak loudly sometimes, doesn't it? It's been one of the worst kept secrets. It hasn't been a secret, really, for many months that this investigation has been ongoing. And before it began, actually, in July, I was somewhat surprised to find that it only began formally in July. I and many others have been trying to bring to the attention of the public and relevant officials that there were activities that raised all sorts of concerns. As I've said many times, I, sitting hundreds of miles from power now and out of my position, noticed patterns as a professional intelligence officer that were extremely alarming. So what it tells us is that the FBI is doing its job, and it only will have open files and start investigations when it believes that it has probable cause or doubt. That is not proof, but the bar is not casual. They have to have what they think are serious enough indications and doubts, concerns to start an investigation. So it's extremely, extremely alarming.
Michael O'Hanlon, what effect is this going to have on the White House and the president's credibility going forward?
Well, yeah, this is a fascinating issue and conversation. I agree a lot with most of what I heard from Mark and Glenn. But let me just add a couple of perspectives that answer your question from my point of view. I think that one thing we should say, this is not meant as a defense of President Trump, but it's sort of an understanding of how this sort of thing is done in American intelligence. Obviously, many of Trump's phone calls, or at least the Trump campaign's phone calls, were wiretapped in some sense. But it's not because of any decision by President Obama to target Trump. It's because people in the Trump universe were talking to Russians, and we do wiretap those calls. This is a very simple point. It may seem so obvious to many people that it's not even worth saying, but that's the one thing in which Trump is sort of right. Of course, the way he said it is exactly wrong in the sense that it was not an explicit decision by President Obama to wiretap him. But many of the calls that he or his campaign at least were involved with Russians were listened to by American intelligence for very good reasons, for long-standing reasons. So I just think it's worth putting things in that context, because otherwise we're just talking past each other in the American political debate right now. Having said that, again, I want to emphasize one more point. This is not a defense of President Trump, because he still is ultimately more wrong than right, because it's not correct to talk about a predecessor president making an explicit decision to wiretap him. That would be illegal. That would be, as Lindsey Graham has said, like Watergate in its implications. And moreover, I think it damages Donald Trump. Mark Jacobson said it damages our alliances abroad. I'm even worried about how it could damage Donald Trump. He's got to step up to the next level of seriousness if he's going to be an effective president. He can't stay wallowed in these sort of Twitter scandals of his own creation. And they were effective for him as a candidate, so I guess I have to give him his due for that. But as president, it's going to get in the way of his ability to rise above sort of, the partisan and gossipy brawl and actually do good for the country. So I'm actually almost as worried about how it's going to damage him once all is said and done and the smoke clears, as opposed to the near-term damage to alliances.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. How much it's going to damage him as well. Does this investigation threaten to ensnare Trump himself at some point? I mean, you talked about Watergate there, and that famous question in those hearings: what did the president know, and when did he know it?
Well, if you're asking me first, I would say I've been trying to go through the various legal concerns here. And of course, they're all hypothetical because we don't know the evidence. We don't know what happened. There are various kinds of concerns. There's been discussion of the Logan Act, Espionage Act. I think it's more likely in the end that there will be probably some connections between the Trump campaign and Russia that make people wonder if there should have been registering as a foreign lobbyist, which is the FARA regulations, or whether any kind of Russian monies made their way to the Trump campaign, which would be, I believe, illegal under American law. I'm not sure either of those two kinds of offenses would be impeachable, but I think they would both be significant and damaging to Mr. Trump over a long-term period of time. But again, this is speculation at this point.
Mark Jacobson, what comparisons would you draw between this and Watergate, which eventually led to President Nixon's resignation back in the 1970s?
Well, it's interesting. Michael's made a good point here on definitions, and I want to loop back to that in a second. But for me, the piece on Watergate is that the cover-up is worse than the crime. And what I've watched over the last year is the Trump campaign, a Trump administration, and those around him denying the contacts with the Russians. And this is why when, if the FBI, if DOD is wiretapping the Russians and you're getting Trump supporters and members of the campaign on there, and then they're denying it, again, the cover-up, the lying about talking to the Russian ambassador, the denials of continued contact between the campaign and the Russians, that's what's going to get them. And I think that's what the lesson of Watergate is. The cover-up is worse than the crime. If, as Michael suggests, it may not even reach that legal threshold.
Glenn Carle, I mean, one of the things that was noticeable in those hearings, when we listened to the questions that were being asked by congressmen, the Democrats were very interested in focusing on this alleged Trump-Russia connection. But the Republicans certainly seem to be more interested in this the intelligence leak that put this story in the headlines to begin with. And I want to focus on that second one. How important is that, do you think? Should they have been focusing on that?
Well, okay, if a man says to an official, look, I have indications that there is espionage going on, I'm pointing the finger at somebody, and then the person listening, receiving that information, says, well, we need to pay attention to the finger rather than the potential espionage, that person is either a charlatan, a fool, or a political partisan. In the scale of significance, quite clearly potential and now established, actually, in some avenues, Russian intelligence involvement in the American electoral process, and possibly with a specific campaign and individuals, far outweighs the eternal issue of who has leaked what to whom in Washington, which yes, is something that should not happen, but is impossible to stop, and is a minor, a venial sin as opposed to a cardinal capital crime. So the reason this is happening is clear. It's to avoid the potential devastating consequences of the investigation.
Michael O'Hanlon, what's your view on that? Is this focus on trying to get at the leaks just a distraction?
Well, you know, I mostly agree with Glenn. I entirely agree with Glenn. But there is one other thing that occurs to me, which is that when President Obama, as the president at the time, had this intelligence committee or community report that made two central points: that Russia had definitely tried to interfere in our elections, as Mark Jacobson also pointed out earlier in the show, but also that there was no evidence that Russia had actually managed to manipulate results or get into the vote counting or what have you. That second point, which I thought was important, was sort of lost because it wasn't that interesting compared to the first point. And the first point was more of a grist for partisan debate that, and obviously there were a lot of Republicans who were incensed by it as well. It wasn't a pure partisan debate by any means. But I thought that perhaps President Obama should have asked the intelligence community to brief the public and the media directly, which is an unusual but not unprecedented practice. And on this point, I think that would have allowed the intelligence community to underscore the second point. There was no evidence that what Russia did amounted to vote tampering or amounted to an actual change of the results. Russia fed in to the cacophony of noise and tried to sway the election. And in a very close election, obviously, every little bit counts. But Russia did not manage to get into our computer counting systems, and therefore they didn't actually determine the outcome or change the numbers. And I think it was really worth getting both those points clearly on the table rather than having them filter out through various people who had been briefed by the intelligence community. So that's my one small suggestion for how this could have been handled differently. But I agree with Glenn that the basic contention that there was somehow criminal leaking doesn't seem to hold water to me.
Mark Jacobson, I know we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but what are the international implications of all of this, the longer this goes on, and to what extent it speaks to the president's credibility as the top representative of the United States in the world?
Right. I think this leads right back to Watergate again. If you look at what the world was asking while the Nixon administration and the United States was going through the tumultuousness of the early 70s, they were saying, what are you people doing over there? The United States was a bastion not only of democracy, but was the gold standard, something to look to, that no matter what, even if our values weren't completely being met, they were aspirational. We believed in a certain standard. We believed in transparency. We believed in an approach to internationalism that would support liberal democracies in the free world. What they are seeing now is not just mistakes that are being made, but they are seeing an active movement by the White House to discount not just multilateral partnerships, but bilateral partnerships. I've just got back from a trip overseas a few weeks ago where I have senior foreign officials telling me that we can no longer trust the United States to be there when we need them. And guess who's going to fill the vacuum? And whether it's North Africa, the Middle East, Europe, it's the Russians. And we certainly know what the fear is in the Baltics. We understand what the fear is in Eastern Europe. But you see this as well in Southeast Asia when it comes to Vietnam and China. So I think that not only are seeing an effect that's damaging on our international partnerships, I think this could be far worse than the damage caused by the singular mistake of going into Iraq in 2003. This, again, could be longer lasting, and I think will shake the way in which the United States is seen by our allies and partners in the world, possibly for decades to come.
Glenn Carle, can I ask you about this this argument that's been put forward by many people on the right, but also some people on the left? This argument about the deep state, that they think they believe operates within the U.S. government in the security and intelligence levels of government. That there are people there who are actively trying to undermine the government. There are people who will say when they're going after people that you don't like, it's the system works. When they're going after people that you do like, then it's the deep state. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's an important point. But if I may, just for a few seconds, I want to make another point. I think it's significant related to the conversations we've just had that Michael raised and addressed a moment ago, and that's the Russian intelligence effect and objectives even in meddling with our election. And then what's become, frankly, a Republican administration talking point is, well, look, there's no evidence that they tampered with the voting. But that misses the larger point. The intelligence operations may try to directly manipulate the number of votes cast or in various ways. But far more often, and what clearly has been happening, rather than that, is to influence the perceptions of the electorate in a way that skews the election. It's a less targeted, I will take 27 votes away kind of thing, but it shapes the perceptions of 310 million Americans so that Hillary is a crook and in their views when she is not, or that the democracy is unfair and gamed, which is not the case. That's what Russian intelligence seeks to do, and that played into
but there's
in
no,
the favor
is there
of,
really any way to measure that?
Well, it's a much more amorphous thing, but you can certainly measure attitudes about with respect to the integrity of the democratic process, of the electoral process, of the candidates in question. All of those things are quantifiable in various ways. It's a much larger task. But I can tell you that this is what intelligence services do. It's a covert action campaign to shift opinion with respect to a whole range of issues. And our democracy, the United States society, have been very clearly affected by the Russian intelligence operation. This is a matter of existential, grave concern. Now, to get to your deep state point, this is a shocking and disgusting thing, frankly. It comes from what we now call the alt-right, which I find to be a rather bland euphemism for what are fascistic, totalitarian, authoritarian, anti-democratic, conspiracy-minded views, which come right out of the 1930s in Italy and Germany. And also, as you pointed out, on the far left, which comes out of communism, not just Marxism, which can be relatively benign, but from a more hostile anti-democratic tradition on the far left, which creates this theory that somehow a bureaucrat like me, deep within the bureaucracy, is manipulating events. This is almost black helicopter trilateral commission conspiracy stuff. It does not happen. Bureaucracies are slow-moving and resistant to change and protect their equities. That is true. That is not the same thing whatsoever. This whole deep state stuff is a lure, a red herring. It doesn't exist. It's phony, and that too contributes to undermining our democracy. It doesn't happen. It doesn't exist.
All right, Michael O'Hanlon, I'll give what's going to be the last word to you. How do you see this playing out then?
Well, I don't know how to wrap everything together. I guess I'll just add one comment, and I take everything Mark Jacobson says seriously all the time, and I agree with him. There are doubts around the world about the United States. I'm a little more hopeful that with, for whatever reason, largely happenstance and good fortune, the quality of the Trump cabinet in foreign policy is extraordinarily high. Donald Trump has not made a lot of good domestic policy picks in my mind, but his foreign policy team is excellent. And I actually think some of the short-term fears are being mitigated by that team. Mattis, Tillerson, McMaster, Pompeo, Coates, Nikki Haley, who's off to a great start as far as I'm concerned. And so I'm hopeful that we'll actually muddle through this period of uncertainty about our alliances and our role in the world. But I am, again, deeply worried about the Trump presidency and the damage Mr. Trump is doing to himself and his own personal credibility from this latest scandal.
All right, we've got to leave it there. Thank you to all three of you, Mark Jacobson, Glenn Carle, and Michael O'Hanlon. Thanks for being on Inside Story. And thank you too for watching. Remember, you can see this program again anytime by going to our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hazem, Sika, and the whole team here, bye for now.